Why do men seem to desire most precisely what they cannot have? Picture this scene. You're walking down the street and see someone who attracts you. You smile, they smile back, but then they turn and continue on their way without looking back. What happens in your mind? Desire ignites, right? That person suddenly becomes more interesting, more desirable, more mysterious. According to Sigmund Freud, this is no coincidence. The father of psychoanalysis revealed a fundamental truth about the human psyche. We desire what resists us. We crave what eludes us. This isn't about manipulation, but understanding the unconscious mechanisms that govern attraction and desire. Today, you'll discover 6 profound signals that explain why strategically ignoring can become the key to igniting authentic interest. This isn't about mind games, but pure psychology. If you want to continue exploring the secrets of human behavior according to Freud, subscribe to the channel. The first signal we'll analyze will surprise you: the effect of psychological scarcity on male desire. Imagine being in a store where there are 2 identical products. One says always available, the other last pieces available. Which would you instinctively buy? The second one, obviously. The same dynamic occurs in human relationships, but at a much deeper and unconscious level. Freud identified this phenomenon through the concept of libido and the pleasure principle. According to Freudian theory, the human mind is programmed to desire what it cannot easily have. When something is too available, the unconscious perceives it as less valuable, less stimulating to the libido. In the context of relationships, this translates into a precise mechanism. When a woman shows herself always available, always reachable, always ready to respond, she unconsciously activates in the man a devaluation mechanism. This isn't malice or superficiality, it's pure psychology. The male unconscious interprets ease of access as lack of value. It's the same reason why a man can lose interest after easily conquering a woman. The primitive brain, governed by the impulses of the Freudian id, constantly seeks new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. When instead a woman is not always available, when she has her own life, projects, passions that sometimes make her unreachable, the scarcity effect kicks in. The man begins to perceive her as a rare, precious good to be conquered. His libido activates, desire grows, interest intensifies. This doesn't mean being false or manipulative. It simply means being complete people, with a rich and independent life. It means not always being there, ready to answer at the first ring, to cancel your own plans for others. Freud explained that this mechanism is linked to our oldest evolutionary programming. Primitive man had to hunt to survive, and the male brain still retains this programming. What requires effort has more value. Have you ever noticed how a man seems more interested when you have a busy evening rather than when you're free? It's not coincidence. It's your unconscious naturally applying the principle of scarcity. Have you ever seen this pattern in your life? Probably yes, without realizing it. But there's something even deeper that governs this mechanism, the unconscious need for challenge that we'll explore in the next chapter. I'll reveal to you why men lose interest when everything becomes too easy. Imagine playing a video game where you always win, where there's no difficulty, no boss to beat, no level to overcome. How long would it take you to get completely bored? Probably very little time. The same principle applies to relational dynamics, but most people don't realize it. Freud identified this mechanism through the analysis of the ego and its needs for self-esteem and realization. The male ego needs to feel competent, capable, winning. When a woman gives herself too easily, she unconsciously deprives the man of this possibility of conquest. It's fundamental to understand that this isn't a man's defect, but a deep psychological mechanism. Man is programmed to feel satisfaction in overcoming obstacles, in earning what he gets. When everything arrives without effort, the unconscious interprets the situation as lack of value or too easy to be true. In the dynamics of attraction, this manifests in very concrete ways. A woman who always responds immediately to messages, who is always free when the man calls, who never has other plans or interests, ends up depriving the man of the satisfaction of conquest. Interest diminishes not because she isn't wonderful, but because the unconscious gratification mechanism doesn't activate. Freud called this phenomenon sublimation of libidinal energy. Sexual and emotional energy needs to be sublimated, transformed through the process of conquest. When this process is missing, energy disperses, interest decreases. On the contrary, when a woman has her own life, when she's not always available, when she has passions and projects that sometimes make her busy, she naturally creates that space of challenge that the male unconscious needs. It's not about being difficult by strategy, but about being complete and fulfilled people. Here's the crucial difference. A self-confident woman doesn't behave this way to manipulate, but because she genuinely has a rich and interesting life. This naturally attracts because it satisfies the unconscious male need for challenge without being artificial. The man begins to wonder, what is she doing? Why didn't she respond immediately? What an interesting life she must have. This curiosity feeds interest, keeps attraction alive, creates that emotional space necessary to make desire grow. Freud emphasized how the reality principle comes into play. The man begins to value more what requires emotional work because his brain perceives it as more authentic, more precious, more real. Do you recognize this pattern in your past relationships? Probably the men who pursued you most were those for whom, initially, you represented a challenge. But there's an even more subtle mechanism operating in parallel, the unconscious fear of missing out, which we'll analyze in the next chapter. I'll show you how the fear of losing something special activates tremendously powerful primitive instincts. Imagine having in your hand a handful of sand. If you keep your hand open and relaxed, the sand stays there. But the moment you close your fist tightly to hold it, what happens? The sand begins to slip away between your fingers. Human relationships work exactly the same way, and Freud understood this perfectly. The father of psychoanalysis identified in the human psyche a fundamental mechanism. The fear of loss is more powerful than the pleasure of possession. This principle, rooted in the deepest unconscious, governs many of our behaviors, especially in love relationships. When a woman is always present, always available, always there, the male unconscious perceives her as safe, controllable, not at risk of escape. Paradoxically, this sense of total security turns off the alarm of fear of loss, and with it, much of the emotional interest. Freud explained this through the concept of separation anxiety. Human beings are programmed to activate all their attachment mechanisms when they perceive the risk of losing something important. But when this risk doesn't exist, the mechanism deactivates, and with it, the emotional intensity. Here's what happens in the depths of the male unconscious. When a woman is not always available, when she has her own life that sometimes takes her elsewhere, the alert mechanism automatically activates. The man unconsciously begins to ask himself, what if I lost her? What if someone else noticed her? What if her interests took her away from me? This isn't pathological insecurity, it's a healthy evolutionary mechanism. Primitive man had to be able to recognize when a precious resource, in this case, a desirable companion, was at risk in order to activate all the necessary behaviors to maintain it. When instead a woman completely eliminates this tension of loss by showing herself totally available and controllable, the unconscious interprets the situation as mission accomplished and reduces emotional investment. The mechanism also works at a biochemical level. Uncertainty, the maybe, the not always, activate the release of dopamine, the neurotransmitter of desire and search. Absolute certainty, on the contrary, reduces dopamine production and increases serotonin, associated with satisfaction but not with desire. The key is balance. It's not about disappearing or being elusive, but maintaining that healthy dose of unpredictability that keeps interest alive. A rich life, personal passions, important friendships, professional projects. All this naturally creates that healthy distance that feeds desire. Freud observed that the most intense and lasting relationships were those where both partners maintained a certain otherness, a personal dimension that wasn't completely accessible to the other. This doesn't create emotional distance, but preserves mystery and interest. Have you ever noticed how your attention lights up when someone you're interested in doesn't respond immediately? It's exactly this mechanism in action. But there's something even deeper, the unconscious need for validation through conquest, which we'll explore in the next chapter. I'll reveal to you why man needs to earn attention to be able to truly appreciate it. Imagine receiving two gifts. One is given to you for no reason, the other you earned with months of commitment and dedication. Which of the two do you keep with more care? Which has more emotional meaning for you? The answer is obvious, but few people apply this principle to relational dynamics. Freud discovered that the human ego has a fundamental need to feel competent and worthy. This need is particularly strong in men for both cultural and evolutionary reasons. When something arrives too easily, the unconscious struggles to attribute real, authentic value to it. In the context of relationships, this mechanism is crucial. A man who obtains the attention, affection, or interest of a woman without having invested emotionally, without having demonstrated his value, without having overcome some tests, unconsciously devalues what he has received. It's not malice or superficiality, it's a deep psychological mechanism called cognitive dissonance. When we receive something precious too easily, our brain struggles to reconcile this fact with the idea that precious things require commitment. The unconscious solution is simple. If I got it easily, it probably wasn't that precious. Freud called this phenomenon the mechanism of value projection. Man projects value onto what has required emotional investment, time, energy, conquest. When instead everything arrives without effort, the valorization mechanism doesn't activate. Here's what happens concretely. A woman who immediately shows herself totally interested, available, involved, unconsciously deprives the man of the possibility to conquer her. He doesn't have the chance to demonstrate his value, to overcome small challenges, to invest emotionally in the relationship. The result? The man finds himself in a passive position as a receiver rather than a conqueror, and this creates deep, unconscious discomfort. Interest diminishes not because the woman isn't wonderful, but because the ego's validation mechanism hasn't activated. On the contrary, when a woman maintains a certain selectivity, when her interest must be earned through consistent behavior, respect, emotional commitment, the man lives a completely different experience. Every small progress in the relationship becomes a confirmation of his personal value. This process of gradual conquest activates powerful gratification mechanisms. The man begins to associate that woman with sensations of success, competence, personal value. The relationship becomes a source of self-esteem and realization. The difference is psychologically enormous. In the first case, the man receives attention without deserving it from the perspective of his unconscious. In the second case, every manifestation of female interest becomes an earned reward, a recognition of his value. Freud observed that the most solid and passionate relationships were those where both partners had the feeling of having conquered something special, of having demonstrated their own value to obtain the other's love. Reflect on your experiences. The men who appreciated you most were those for whom you maintained a certain initial selectivity. But there's an even more subtle aspect, the projection mechanism that we'll analyze in the next chapter. I'll show you how man projects extraordinary qualities onto what he cannot easily have. Imagine looking at a beautiful house from outside, with lit windows but closed curtains. Your mind automatically begins to imagine how it is inside. you'll probably mentally furnish it even more beautifully than it could actually be. Why? Because the human brain fills information gaps with the best possible projections. Freud identified this as one of the most powerful defense mechanisms of the unconscious: projection. When we don't have complete information about something or someone, we project our expectations, our desires, our ideals to fill the gaps. In relationships, this mechanism is explosive. A woman who maintains a certain mystery, who doesn't immediately reveal every detail of her life, her emotions, her thoughts, unconsciously allows the man to complete the picture with his positive projections. The male unconscious begins to fill the empty spaces with extraordinary qualities. She surely has a fascinating life. She must be a deep person. She probably has interesting experiences I don't know yet. These projections create an idealized image that powerfully feeds attraction. Freud explained that this mechanism is linked to our pleasure principle. We tend to project onto informational voids everything we desire to find. It's the same reason why a book that leaves some things unsaid involves us more than one that explains everything in minute detail. The opposite is equally powerful. A woman who reveals herself completely from the start, who shares every thought, every emotion, every detail of her day, leaves no room for positive projections. The man has nothing to imagine, to discover, to idealize. This doesn't mean being false or hiding who you really are. It simply means respecting the natural timing of mutual knowledge, allowing interest to grow gradually, maintaining that dose of mystery that feeds curiosity. Freud observed that in lasting relationships, partners continued to discover each other even after years. This was because they always maintained a dimension of themselves that wasn't completely accessible to the other. Personal hobbies, exclusive friendships, spaces for individual reflection. The mechanism also works at a neurological level. Uncertainty and mystery activate dopamine production, the neurotransmitter of curiosity and desire. The brain interprets the not completely known as potentially gratifying, and this keeps attention high. A woman who always has something new to reveal, who maintains some aspects of her personality as surprises to discover over time, constantly activates this mechanism of interest and positive projection. The man begins to associate her with sensations of discovery, novelty, personal growth. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to learn something new and fascinating. The relationship maintains that freshness that is often lost when everything becomes known and predictable. Freud emphasized a crucial point. It's not about being elusive or detached, but about being people so rich and multifaceted that there's always something new to discover. Have you ever noticed how some movies stay with you precisely because they don't explain everything? The same principle applies to human relationships. But there's the last and deepest mechanism we need to explore, the primitive hunting instinct that we'll analyze in the final chapter. I'll reveal to you how this ancestral instinct is still very active in the modern male unconscious. Imagine being on a safari and seeing two animals, one approaching docilely, the other moving fast and free in the savannah. Which of the two would instinctively capture your attention? Which would awaken your hunter's instinct? The answer is obvious, and this same mechanism still operates today in the male unconscious. Freud, studying the human unconscious, discovered that we preserve in our deepest psyche the evolutionary programming of thousands of years ago. Modern man, despite civilization, still maintains the instinct of the primitive hunter who had to chase to survive and reproduce. This isn't a defect to correct, but a psychological reality to understand. The hunting instinct doesn't mean violence or possession, but the deep need to conquer through commitment, strategy, perseverance. It's the same instinct that drives modern man to excel at work, in sports, in personal projects. In relationships, this instinct manifests in a very specific way. Man is programmed to feel excitement and satisfaction in chasing something that moves, that doesn't stay still, that requires commitment to be reached. A woman who maintains a certain dynamism, who has a life in movement, who is never completely captured, automatically activates this instinct. Freud called this phenomenon sublimation of the hunting instinct. The primitive energy of the hunter transforms into courtship, into romantic interest, into desire for emotional conquest. But for this mechanism to activate, there must be something to hunt. A woman always still, always available, always predictable, doesn't activate this instinct. The male unconscious perceives her as prey already captured, and interest diminishes drastically. It's not lack of affection or appreciation. It's simply that the evolutionary mechanism of attraction deactivates. On the contrary, a woman who maintains a dynamic life, personal goals, passions that carry her in movement, constantly activates this instinct. The man unconsciously perceives that he must keep up, must demonstrate his value, must continuously conquer her attention and interest. This creates an electrifying dynamic. The man feels constantly stimulated to give his best, to grow, to improve himself, to be worthy of such an interesting and dynamic woman. The relationship becomes a source of mutual personal growth. Freud observed that the most passionate couples were those where both partners maintained this dynamic of reciprocal conquest. It wasn't about mind games, but about being people so interesting and evolving that the other constantly felt the desire to earn their love. The hunting instinct needs movement, challenge, growth. A static relationship where everything is taken for granted and predictable extinguishes this tremendously powerful instinct. A dynamic relationship where there's always something to discover, to conquer, to earn, keeps it alive forever. The key isn't being elusive, but being people so rich and growing that there's always a new dimension of ourselves to make known and appreciated. This keeps the hunting instinct alive in a healthy and constructive way. Reflect on your current life. Are you maintaining that dynamism that feeds the hunting instinct, or have you become too static in your relationships? Freud taught us that understanding these mechanisms doesn't mean manipulating them, but using them to create more authentic, passionate, and lasting relationships. These aren't tricks or manipulations, but deep truths about the human psyche. Freud showed us that understanding the unconscious allows us to create more authentic and passionate relationships. The real question now is, are you ready to become the version of yourself that naturally activates these mechanisms, not to manipulate, but to be the complete, interesting, and dynamic woman you deserve to be? What city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below.